Thank you. Sorry, we're just running a little bit ahead of schedule, so.
Fine.
And your submission is page 77. I'm just saying this for a colleague so that they can turn to page 77 on their document. Thank you.
Right. Well, the main point of my submission relates to the so-called accessible city regime. My husband and I have been running a yoga studio just down the road in Hereford Street for almost 4 years now. It's not been easy trading conditions. We lived through the demolition of buildings across the road, and then land mitigation for 7 months. Our entire building shook. People were lying on the floor with their heads bouncing. And then the building going up, I'd show up to teach a 6:15 a.m. class and there'd be 20 concrete trucks pouring concrete. And we got through all that. Our business has grown a lot from scratch 4 years ago. We now get through about 130 people a day, every day, through our studio. But I know that we would not survive the accessible cities regime coming down Hereford Street. We wouldn't. And our lease is up for renewal in July, and we're not staying. We're going. I look at those businesses in Manchester Street, in St. Asaph Street, in Cambridge Terrace, and I think if that's where our studio was, we'd go under. And we fought too hard to get it to where it is, to have that happen to us. So we're going. We're one of the pioneers of the Central City rebuild. We're one of the rock stars of it, and you've driven us out. So stop. In the words of David Longy, it's time to stop and have a cup of tea. Think again. I look at that accessible cities regime, I think, did anyone involved in it have any traffic engineering expertise at all? Where was the analysis of what effect this was going to have on businesses? There isn't one, I've asked. There wasn't. You can't keep pushing ahead with it. My submission has asked you specifically not to do this to Victoria Street because one of the places we're looking at going to is Victoria Street. And that just breaks my heart. I've loved being part of the Central City. I don't want to be out there. I don't want to be even further out in the suburbs, but I feel like we're not being given a choice. If I go out to the suburbs, then City Council-owned streets are a great big free parking lot for all my students. They like that. They go to the one out in Mandeville Street and park for free in the streets out there. They come in to my studio and say, well, we like your yoga better, but we can park for free out there. And when they're just paying for an $18 class, paying $6 parking on top of it or getting a $65 parking ticket makes a big difference. It makes it really hard to compete no matter how much better we are. You own the streets out there just as you own the streets in the Central City. You could be using both of them as a cash cow. But you just do that in the Central City. Last year, almost $9 million you got out of Central City parking. You take that all out of the Central City economy, out of the businesses, out of the people who might otherwise spend that money buying a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or something. You need to level the playing field in that regard. If you want people to come into the Central City, then sure, it can't be entirely free parking because the people who work in here would just use up all the parks, but I've asked for the first 2 hours at least to be free so that people who are trying to run their businesses in the Central City, doing the right thing by the entire city, are not disadvantaged. That's my presentation. Any questions?
Have you, because you've mentioned the funding for the Central City Business Association, and I think that the argument's been made is that it's a very valuable service, and the request for the funding to be reinstated at a higher level is, or closer to where it was before, is because it's really a transitional position, because ultimately when businesses are up and running and the whole Central City is thriving, then it is something that the Business Association would pay for itself through...
Well, I know that's one of the thought streams, but if you look at it, what you're doing with Central City parking, $9 million a year that you're sucking out of the Central City economy, asking for $150,000 back, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what you're getting in parking fees. It's basically a targeted rate. If there was to be a business improvement district or whatever we are, that would function through a targeted rate.
Yeah.
Well, this is effectively a targeted rate anyway. We're just asking for a bit back. And this is not, I am on the Central City Business Association. This is not Central City Business Association's policy. This is just my thought, that when you're getting that much out of the businesses and the customers of the businesses in the Central City, giving suburban businesses an advantage by giving them free parking, it's just slightly, giving something back to help us organize ourselves to compete against the malls, to compete against the suburban businesses.
I think technology is going to make what you're asking for in terms of, but I mean, turnover of cars is absolutely vital to the businesses as well. And, the mechanism that's been used has been the parking fee, and the mechanism, I think, will get much easier to make a proportion of it free with a time limit capped on it. Once we've got apps in, instead of dealing with coins going into meters, I think, the modern technology that we will go to will help resolve that problem.
Okay, but your point in the meantime regarding the business association, yeah, it is transitional. We've built the membership from, it was basically the Restart Mall a couple of years ago, up to over 200 businesses.
Yeah.
The businesses that are in there, most of us can't afford to pay a levy.
Yeah,
I don't belong to the Chamber of Commerce because they charge a levy.
Yeah, no, I fully get that. I think where I was leading to was the need for businesses such as yourself to engage with the wider group in terms of, rather than making an individual impassioned plea on an accessible city, which is the chapter of the Central City Recovery Plan, which has the weighting of law under the
I understand that. I was a resource management lawyer for 23 years. I understand that.
So us fixing something that
it's not written in stone. It can be changed.
It can be changed, but we are trying to make changes without having to go through an entire reconsultation process, which will re-engage and probably re-enrage people on both sides of the argument. So we are working with the representatives of the Central City businesses, and what I'm saying is that connecting with the people that we're working with would actually be a helpful thing to channel your energy into in terms of dealing with us directly on
I know,
an accessible
that's
city.
why I'm a member of the Christchurch,
Yep.
the CCBA,
Yes.
absolutely.
I know. So Yanni, then Phil.
Thank you. So just in terms of the car parking, one of the things that Council's done is remove public car parking from our strategic asset list. We've had other submitters say that we should reintroduce that. Do you see Council should have a role in publicly owning off-street car parking buildings to deal with the issues that you've raised in terms of things like the high cost from private providers that discourages people?
Yes, I do. I know you can't be everything to everyone, but that is something that was done before the earthquakes. I don't see a problem with carrying that on after the earthquakes. Right. I know that the plan for the Central City was that there were to be more smaller car parking buildings here and there, and that is starting to be the case. But if they're all in private ownership, we'll end up, the way it is in Sydney, with it costing $70 or $80 to park a car for the day. Unless the City Council's actually in there and providing a reasonable alternative and keeping, the competitive need to keep costs down, we'll end up with off-street parking that is just too expensive.
Thank you. And just the second question was, you've talked about the Accessible City program, and I would support us doing a complete review of that, which I see as perfectly possible under the Regeneration Act and so forth. But I just wanted to understand if putting the design concerns to one side, is it also the pace of work and the way in which the work's being done that's causing the problem?
Of that. I mean, Manchester Street has taken a ridiculous amount of time. So has Cambridge Terrace.
Right.
It is taking a long time, and partly that's because there's so much work being done that just shouldn't be done. Okay. The narrowing of the roads. I'll tell you, the other day I was trying to drive south along Colombo Street, And as is usually the case, the northbound traffic was basically at a standstill for 3 or 4 blocks back. And an ambulance tried to drive north. And so it pulled out into the southbound lane that I was trying to drive up. I had to back down Colombo Street. I just about ran over a cyclist.
Yeah.
That's you shouldn't even call it Colombo Street anymore. It should be Colombo Lane.
Right.
It's not operating as a road.
So a lot of the work that's taking a long time is central government. Have you raised these concerns also with the ministers?
But this was the reason that I raised
Cambridge
about
Terrace
working with the business
or-
association, because Otakaro is in the conversation with the city council.
Yeah.
But the Otakaro projects, at the end of the day, they're doing projects on our streets. So we have to take ownership of it. And I agree with Yanni that an accessible city has become a sort of, it's almost like a shorthand for a whole lot of things that it is, but a whole lot of things that it isn't as well, because there are things that have been done under an accessible city project which people are perfectly happy with, but the things that they're not happy with are things that there's multiple layers of things, but one is the speed or the lack of speed in some of the projects, and in the conversations that we're having now with other projects is, can we get contracts that work at night and on weekends? And I mean, I've been shocked to see work closed down at 6 o'clock on a weekday night.
And not just then, Manchester Street, nothing happens there for days on end.
I know.
And I know if it is Otakaro rather than the city council, that's perhaps nothing that
Yeah,
it's your fault.
It's not that we can. Yeah, it's not a question of fault. It's a question of how do we find a resolution? How do we get the things that need to be done much more quickly? And how do we review those things that haven't been? How do we make changes that don't necessarily override the underlying principles of an accessible city, which actually people generally agree with, which is to make the city more accessible for all.
I don't think people got that when you were doing consultation. I don't think people really understood how much of the parking was going to be removed and how much of the roading capacity was actually going to be removed. I think they're shocked.
I've gone back and looked at the images of the original consultation document, and you just feel like there's a lot more room in the street, there's a lot more room in lanes, so when you're drawing nice pictures of what it's going to be like, it didn't really get the response.
No, because they come into my studio and they go, do you see what they've done to Durham Street?
Yeah.
I can't believe it. It's so narrow. You can't even drive a car down there, safely. And nobody really thought it was going to be like that during consultation.
No, I agree, including me. Phil and then Dion.
Thanks, Margo, for your submission. One thing I was just a wee bit puzzled about was around Accessible City, regarding cycling, as you've indicated too. You're really saying, look, it's quite dangerous. But later on, you're also supporting a bike share arrangement. So I'm just wondering, how would you arrive at safe cycling for a bike share?
What's making it dangerous is the narrowness of the roads. Because, for example, Colombo Street, the cyclists still think that they can sneak up in between the parked cars and the driving cars. And there's simply not room for that. Because the cars that are supposed to be driving aren't moving. And so the cyclists think, well, I'm not waiting in line with these cars. And they sneak up inside, and it's just dangerous. I had a young doctor who practices with me come into my studio a couple of weeks back, and she just looked ashen. She rides a bike everywhere. She doesn't even own a car, and she lives in Sumner and works at the hospital. And she came in and she said, I never used to feel this unsafe on a bike, but now I don't want to ride my bike in the central city anymore.
So how would you perhaps suggest we have cycle lanes in the inner city to make them safe?
If you had just left all of the streets the way they were before the earthquakes, repair the underground infrastructure, I understand that. Leave the streets as they were. I like the 30-kilometre speed limit. Slow the cars down. The bike sharing scheme results in there being so many bikes on the road, the cars can't drive any faster, and all the bikes are safer. You don't need to have separate cycle lanes if everyone's going nice and slow.
That's a shared space, which is certainly one of the intentions. Dion, and then I'll have to.
Thank you for your deputation. It was really good to hear about those impacts, because it is having quite a problem, and I'm getting it in the neck all the time from business owners around the city about these issues. And I'm afraid that if we don't get it right, that we're not going to have an economic heart that actually we're doing all this work for nothing. But one of the things I wanted to ask about was, actually just on that, Durham Street night works are going to happen on Durham Street for the next 3 nights. They're actually going to close part of the Durham Street and actually just get a lot of those intersections out of the way over the next 3 nights, which is good. But there's no mention of public transport. And so one of the things I find a bit risky about this conversation in an accessible city is that it seems to be becoming cars versus cyclists. There's a lot of that. But do any of your users use public transport at all, and do they find that experience?
But I have, like, for example, I've got a woman in her 70s who lives in Amberley who comes in to see me twice a week. She's not going to take a bus to take a 1 hour class.
No, but what about the people that do live around the city? I'm just trying to find out.
Yeah, some do, and they like the new bus interchange. It's kind of a timing thing. When you're only taking a class for 1 hour, if you've got to spend an hour on the bus and then an hour in the class and then another hour, suddenly you've taken 3 hours to do yoga. If you can drive there in 10 minutes, do your class and drive back, that makes more sense.
So there's a big convenience factor.
Yeah.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah. Look, thank you very much, and I mean, I do encourage you to continue to work with the Business Association. We've continued to meet with them. Otakaro is engaged in that process, and we are hopeful that we'll get a good result out of that. So thank you very much for your submission.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Karina Brown.
Yes.